Mist clings to the mountains like a half-remembered dream, curling between the cedar trunks and settling into the valleys where ancient rivers have carved their patient paths through stone over thousands of silent years. The air here carries the scent of pine resin and cold iron. Somewhere far below, a temple bell resonates once, then dissolves into the grey morning, leaving only the soft hush of wind through bamboo. This is Ashina, a land of towering fortresses and frozen passes, of steep ravines where the water runs white and furious over black volcanic rock. The mountains here are not gentle. They rise like the spines of sleeping dragons, their peaks vanishing into clouds that never seem to break. And in the shadow of those peaks, a clan once forged its name in blood and fire, and an unyielding refusal to be conquered. The Ashina Clan did not always rule these lands. There was a time when they were wanderers, exiles, a people without a homeland to call their own. They were warriors, yes, fierce and disciplined and bound by codes older than the mountains themselves, but warriors without a country are only mercenaries. And mercenaries, no matter how skilled, are eventually consumed by the very violence they trade in. But then came Ashina, a man whose name would come to echo through every valley and fortress, every battlefield and burial ground in the entire province. He was not born to greatness in the way that bards prefer their heroes to be born. No prophecy attended his arrival. No comet streaked the sky. He was simply a man of extraordinary will, a swordsman of such devastating precision that the great lords of the surrounding territories spoke his name in low, uneasy tones around their evening fires. Through decades of war, through campaigns that stretched across seasons and soaked the mountain passes in the blood of thousands, Ashina carved out a kingdom from the wilderness. He reclaimed the ancestral homeland of his people. He built Ashina Castle on its great stone foundations, its walls rising tier upon tier until the keep itself seemed to grow from the mountain like a natural formation, like something the earth had produced rather than human hands. And the people came, farmers, artisans, monks, soldiers. They filled the valleys with their villages and the mountain roads with their commerce. Ashina became a place of power, a place of pride. But what is power without something to protect it? What is a kingdom without a future? These are the questions that would come to haunt the people of Ashina in the years ahead. They are the quiet questions, the ones that keep old men awake in the dark hours before dawn. And the answers, when they finally arrived, would be stranger and more terrible than anyone could have imagined. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let the mist settle for a moment. Let the bell's echo fade. There is more to this story, and it begins not with the conqueror, but with a child. O3 the Divine Heir. The boy's name was Kuro. He was small for his age, quiet in the way that children are quiet when they have spent too much time in the company of adults who speak about them rather than to them. His eyes were dark and very still, like pools of water at the bottom of a well, and like those pools they held depths that no one could easily read. Kuro was the Divine Heir. This title was not given lightly, nor was it inherited in the ordinary fashion of lords and nobles. It was something older than bloodline, older than dynasty. It was a covenant written into the very marrow of his bones, a sacred burden placed upon him by forces that even the wisest monks of Senpu Temple could only partially comprehend. The dragon's heritage flowed through his veins. To understand what this means, one must first understand the nature of the dragon itself. Long ago, in an age before the Ashina clan had any name, a divine being descended upon these lands from the west, not from across the sea, not from beyond some mountain range, from the west in a way that transcends ordinary geography, from the divine realm itself, a place where the boundaries between life and death, between existence and oblivion, are as thin and permeable as morning fog. The dragon carried within it a gift, or perhaps a curse. The distinction, as the people of Ashina would come to learn, depends entirely on one's perspective. The gift was immortality, not the immortality of legend, not the invulnerability of gods in children's stories. This was something more complex, more unsettling. The dragon's blood could restore the dead. It could knit together severed flesh, restart a heart that had stopped beating, pull a soul back from the threshold of whatever waits beyond. But it did so at a cost that revealed itself slowly over time, like a rot that begins at the core of a seemingly healthy tree. Those who received the dragon's heritage did not age, they did not sicken, they could not be killed by ordinary means, but the power did not belong to them. It passed through them, like light through glass, and the glass itself was slowly changed by the passage. Kuro understood this, even as a child. He understood that he was not simply a boy, not simply a member of the Ashina household by adoption and political arrangement. He was a vessel, a conduit for a power that was ancient and indifferent and vast beyond human comprehension. The dragon's blood did not care about the ambitions of warlords or the survival of nations. It simply was, in the way that a river simply is, and the people along its banks could either learn to swim or be swept away. The monks of Senpu Temple had studied the dragon's heritage for generations. They had built their temple complex deep in the mountains, far from the politics of Ashina Castle, precisely so they could devote themselves to understanding the nature of divine immortality. Their libraries were filled with scrolls written in fading ink, their meditation halls lined with statues of beings that were neither quite human nor quite something else. And what they discovered disturbed them. The dragon's power was not meant for this world. It was a gift given in error, or perhaps in mercy, by a being that did not fully understand the consequences of bestowing eternity upon mortal flesh. The immortality it granted was not peace, it was a chain, a beautiful, gleaming chain that bound its bearer to an endless cycle of suffering and renewal, of death and resurrection, of loss repeated forever without the mercy of forgetting. The monks sought a way to sever the bond, but severance, they learned, required tools that did not yet exist, or rather, tools that existed but had been hidden away in places where no mortal was meant to go. And so the question remained open, hanging over Ashina like a blade suspended by the thinnest thread. What does one do with a power that cannot be controlled? What does one do with a gift that devours its bearer? 600. The dragon's heritage. The dragon came from beyond the western horizon, not from a country, not from a continent, from somewhere else entirely, a place the old texts call the Divine Realm, a place that exists alongside the mortal world, the way a reflection exists alongside the water that holds it, close enough to touch perhaps, but impossible to enter by any ordinary road. When the dragon descended, it brought with it the power of the divine waters. These waters seeped into the earth, pooled in hidden caverns, and fed the roots of trees that grew strangely, and bore fruit no one dared to eat. The Fountainhead Palace, high in the mountains, beyond the mortal realm's ordinary reach, became the seat of this power, a place where the waters gathered and the boundary between worlds grew thin as paper. The dragon's blood was the medium through which this power travelled. It was not blood in the ordinary sense. It was more like a current, a living river of energy that could be passed from one bearer to the next, through acts of tremendous will or desperate need. When a mortal received the dragon's blood, they were changed. Their wounds closed, their aging ceased, death, when it came for them, found the door locked and the windows barred. But the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Those who are resurrected by the dragon's blood carried within them a creeping corruption. The Japanese texts call it dragon rot, a sickness that does not affect the immortal bearer directly, but spreads to everyone around them. Every resurrection, every return from death, costs something. Not from the bearer, but from the world, from the people who had the misfortune of standing too close when the dragon's power surged. The sick coughed and wheezed. their vitality drained away. They became hollow versions of themselves, their eyes dimming, their voices fading to whispers. And the bearer of the dragon's blood would watch this happen, knowing that their continued existence was the cause, knowing that every moment they persisted in the world of the living was another moment stolen from someone else. This was the cruelty of the dragon's gift. It promised eternity, but delivered only guilt. It offered immortality, but exacted attacks measured in the suffering of innocence. And the bearer could not simply choose to die, because the dragon's blood would not permit it. The power had its own logic, its own imperatives, and they did not include mercy. The monks of Senpu Temple understood this better than anyone. They had witnessed the dragon rot spreading through their own ranks, watched their brothers and sisters wither and fade while the bearer of the blood, a figure they had once revered as sacred, continued to walk among them, ageless and untouched. They had experimented desperately, seeking ways to contain the power, to redirect it, to transform it into something that did not devour everything it touched. Some of their experiments were noble, others were monstrous. The line between the two, they discovered, becomes very thin when eternity is at stake. They created beings that were neither alive nor dead, creatures of divine water and mortal longing, twisted into shapes that bore only the faintest resemblance to their original forms. They sought the mortal blade, a weapon forged specifically to end the lives of those the dragon's blood had made undying. They whispered prayers to a dragon that could not hear them, or perhaps chose not to listen, and still the question remained. Is immortality a gift, or is it the deepest form of imprisonment? Tenuk, the interior ministry's threat. Far to the east, beyond the mountain passes and the tangled forests that guarded Ashina's borders, a great power was stirring. The interior ministry, the central authority of the land, the bureaucratic machinery of empire that had watched Ishin Ashina's rise with a mixture of admiration and unease, had begun to turn its attention toward the mountain kingdom, not with admiration, with hunger. Ashina was rich in strategic position, rich in natural resources, rich in something far more valuable than gold or iron. Ashina held the divine waters. Ashina held the dragon's heritage. And the interior ministry, with its network of spies and scholars and theologians, had learned what that power could do. They wanted it. The ministry's armies began to mass along the borders. Scouts appeared in the mountain passes, their dark armour blending with the shadowed rock. Trade routes were quietly disrupted. Allies were bought or intimidated. The net, invisible at first, began to tighten around Ashina like a slowly closing fist. And Ishin was old. The great warrior who had carved a kingdom from the wilderness was now a man in his twilight years. His blade arm was still strong, his mind still sharp, but the fire that had once driven him across a dozen battlefields had dimmed to embers. He had fought his wars, he had won his peace, and now, in the quiet of his castle, he could feel the shadows lengthening. His grandson, Genichiro, watched the borders with growing alarm. The interior ministry did not come with banners and drums. They came with whispers and promises and the quiet accumulation of pressure. They turned Ashina's own people against the clan, sowed dissent in the ranks of the army, and placed their agents in positions of trust. The siege, when it came, would not be a siege of walls and catapults. It would be a siege of patience. Ashina was dying, not all at once, not with the dramatic finality of a fortress stormed and burned, but slowly, the way a tree dies when its roots are cut. The leaves still green for a while, the branches still reaching toward the sun, but the nourishment gone, the connection to the earth severed, and only the illusion of life remaining. The interior ministry knew this. They were willing to wait, but they did not reckon with the desperation of a grandson who loved his homeland more than his own soul. 1400, Genichiro's desperation. Genichiro stood on the ramparts of Ashina Castle and looked out over the land his grandfather had won. The wind tugged at his hair, carrying with it the scent of distant smoke. Somewhere beyond the mountains, the interior ministry's forces were gathering. He could feel them the way a deer feels the presence of a wolf, not through sight or sound, but through some deeper, older faculty that lives in the blood and whispers of danger. He was not his grandfather. This was the truth that haunted Genichiro, the shadow that walked beside him through every corridor of the castle, sat beside him at every council meeting, lay beside him in the dark hours when sleep would not come. Ishin had been a force of nature, a man who bent the world to his will through sheer, unstoppable momentum. Genichiro was something else, a student, a seeker, a man who had trained relentlessly, who had pushed his body and mind to their absolute limits, and who had discovered, with a quiet, devastating clarity, that his limits were not enough to save Ashina. He had studied the way of Tomo, the lightning arts, the forbidden techniques that his mentor Lady Tomo had brought from a distant land. He had mastered the bow, the blade, the arcane disciplines that ordinary soldiers could only marvel at. And still, when he looked at the forces arrayed against his homeland, he felt the cold grip of inadequacy. There was only one power great enough to turn the tide, the dragon's heritage, Kuro's blood. Genichiro had watched the boy from a distance, had studied the reports of the monks with scholarly attention, had pieced together the full scope of what the dragon's blood could offer. An army that could not die, soldiers who would rise again and again, no matter how many times they were cut down, an immortal defence that would break the Interior Ministry's patience and turn their calculated siege into an impossible war of attrition. It was madness. Genichiro knew this. The monks had warned of the dragon rot. He had read their reports, seen the evidence with his own eyes. The hollowed villagers, the dying monks, the creeping sickness that spread like ink through water whenever the dragon's power was invoked. To use Kuro's blood to create an immortal army would be to poison the very land he sought to protect. But what choice remained? When you are drowning, you do not question the hand that reaches down to save you. You grasp it, you hold on, and you deal with the consequences when the water is no longer filling your lungs. Genichiro made his choice. He would take the dragon's heritage by force if necessary. He would bind Kuro to the service of Ashina, compel the boy to share his blood with the soldiers who stood on the walls and watched the shadows gather. It was not what a hero would do, it was not what his grandfather would have done, but Ishin had won his wars with a sword. Genichiro would have to win his with a curse. 1800, The Wolf's Journey. There is a saying among the shinobi: a shinobi's purpose is to kill, not to question, not to judge, not to weigh the morality of the mission against some abstract ideal of justice. A shinobi receives a task, and the task is completed. The blade falls, the target falls. The shinobi vanishes into the shadows like smoke in wind. The wolf had lived by this code for as long as he could remember. He had no family name, no childhood memories of warmth or laughter. He had been found as a child on a battlefield, half dead among the corpses, and raised by a man called Owl, a master shinobi whose kindness, as the wolf would come to understand much later, was not entirely without calculation. Owl saw in the boy a tool, a weapon to be sharpened and pointed at the world's throat. The wolf learned quickly. His body was small, but his reflexes were extraordinary, and he possessed a quality that all great shinobi share: the ability to become invisible, not through magic or trickery, but through sheer, concentrated absence. He could stand in a room and simply not be noticed, the way a stone at the bottom of a river is not noticed by the current flowing over it. He was given a purpose: protect the Divine Heir. Kuro, the quiet boy with the ancient eyes, the vessel for a power that could unmake death itself. The wolf would guard him with his life, would stand between the boy and every threat that the world could produce, would be the unbreachable wall behind which the Divine Heir could live in safety. For a time, this arrangement held. The wolf shadowed Kuro through the corridors of Ashina Castle, through the gardens and the courtyards and the torchlit halls where the clan's retainers gathered to discuss the business of state. He was always there, always watching, always ready. And Kuro, for his part, seemed to accept the wolf's presence with a quiet grace that was neither gratitude nor indifference, but something gentler, a recognition, perhaps, that they were both bound by forces larger than themselves. Then Genichiro came. The battle was brief and brutal. Genichiro was no ordinary warrior. His mastery of the way of Tomo, his lightning-fast blade work, his sheer desperate conviction made him a force that the wolf, skilled as he was, could not overcome. The wolf fell. His arm was severed. His life bled out onto the cold stone of the castle courtyard. He should have died, but Kuro's blood touched his wounds, and the dragon's heritage surged through him like fire through dry kindling. The wolf woke. His arm was gone, replaced by a prosthetic of iron and wood, a shinobi tool of devastating versatility. His body was whole. His heart was beating, and the world that should have ended for him simply continued. He was bound now, bound to Kuro by a debt that could never be repaid, bound to the dragon's blood by a covenant he had not chosen, bound to a path that would lead him through the darkest places in the land and demand everything he had. The wolf rose, he took up his blade, and he set out to reclaim the master he had sworn to protect. The journey ahead would take him through burning fortresses and flooded valleys, through ancient temples where monks practiced their terrible experiments in the shadow of golden Buddhas, through forests haunted by creatures that had once been human before the dragon's power twisted them into something else. He would face warriors and demons, assassins and gods. He would die and die again, and rise again, each resurrection bringing him closer to his goal, but also closer to the terrible understanding of what that goal truly cost. But the wolf was a shinobi, and a shinobi's purpose is to complete the mission, whatever it takes. 2200, Fountainhead Palace, beyond the mortal world, hidden behind cascades of sacred water that poured from some impossible height into pools of liquid crystal, lay the Fountainhead Palace. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that makes the chest ache, that fills the eyes with tears, not of sorrow, but of something older and more nameless, the beauty of a place that exists outside of time, where the flowers bloom eternally and the music never stops, and the great tree at the centre of everything spreads its branches toward a sky that has never known darkness. The divine waters gathered here. They flowed from the roots of the great tree, pooled in the courtyards of the palace, and cascaded down through hidden channels into the mortal world below. These were the waters that carried the dragon's power, the waters that had blessed and cursed the people of Ashina for generations. Here, at their source, the boundary between mortal and divine was so thin that one could step across it without even noticing. The palace was inhabited, not by gods exactly, or not by gods in the way that mortals understand the word. The nobles of Fountainhead Palace had once been human, perhaps, in some unimaginably distant past, but the divine waters had changed them. They had become something else, beings of ethereal grace and terrible hunger, their beauty preserved, but their humanity drained away like wine from a cracked vessel. They danced and feasted and played their music, and beneath the surface of their eternal revelry lay an emptiness so vast that the mind recoils from contemplating it. They had drunk too deeply of the waters. They had traded their mortality for something that looked like paradise, but felt like a cage made of silk and starlight. They could not die. They could not change. They could not grow or diminish or transform. They simply were, forever, and the forever of it had hollowed them out until only the shell remained. This was the dragon's gift in its purest form, not the rough, compromised immortality of the mortal world, with its dragon rot and its resurrections and its terrible costs. This was immortality complete and unfiltered, immortality as the dragon itself understood it, a state of perfect, unending, unchanging existence. And it was, the wolf realized as he moved through the palace's luminous halls, the most horrifying thing he had ever witnessed, because to exist without change is not life. It is a museum exhibit, a painting trapped behind glass, a song caught in an endless loop, its melody beautiful, but its repetition turning that beauty into a kind of torture. The great tree at the heart of Fountainhead Palace bore strange fruit. viscous tears of crystallized divine essence that pulsed with an inner light. These were the dragon's tears. They held within them the key to ending the cycle, to severing the dragon's heritage from the mortal world and returning the gift, or the curse, to its rightful place beyond the horizon. But obtaining them was no simple task. The palace did not surrender its treasures willingly. Its guardians were vast and ancient, and driven by imperatives that had nothing to do with mercy. The waters themselves fought to preserve their source, surging and crashing against the intruder who dared to walk their sacred paths. And somewhere in the depths of the palace, the dragon waited. Not as a creature of scales and fire, not as the dragons of old legends, as a presence. A vast, sorrowful, incomprehensible presence that filled the palace the way water fills a bowl, completely, from every direction, pressing against the walls of reality itself. The dragon had not asked to come to this world. It had not intended to burden mortals with its gift. It simply was what it was, and the consequences of its existence were not its to bear. The wolf climbed toward the tree. He reached for the tears, and in that moment, the full weight of what he was about to do settled upon his shoulders like a mantle woven from starlight and shadow. And 2500, the choice, Severance or Immortality. The mortal blade was forged to kill what cannot be killed. Two blades existed. The crimson mortal blade, called Gracious Gift of Tears, could slay the undying, its edge cutting through the dragon's protection as easily as a hot knife through snow. The black mortal blade, called Open Gate, could sever the connection between the divine and the mortal, closing the door through which the dragon's power had entered the world. Both blades demanded a price. To draw the mortal blade was to die, not a temporary death, not a resurrection fueled by the dragon's blood, a real death, a final death, a death from which there was no return. Only those who were already immortal could draw the blade and survive, the paradox sustaining them, through the very power the blade was designed to destroy. The wolf held the blade in his prosthetic hand, and now the choice lay before him, as clear and as terrible as a blade's edge in morning light. Severance, the ending of the dragon's heritage. The blade would cut the bond between the divine waters and the mortal world, sending the dragon's power back to the realm from which it came. Kuro would be freed from his burden. The dragon rot would cease, the cycle of death and resurrection would end, and the world would return to its natural order, where things lived and died and were mourned and were forgotten, as they were always meant to do. But severance meant the wolf's death as well. He was sustained by the dragon's blood. He was bound to Kuro by a covenant of blood and sacrifice. To sever the heritage was to sever himself from the world, to complete his final mission, and then step quietly and permanently into the silence that waits at the end of all things. Was this not what a shinobi was for? To serve, to protect, to complete the mission, and then disappear, leaving behind only the memory of a task fulfilled and the quiet gratitude of the one who was saved. There were other paths, darker paths. The path of Shura, where the wolf could surrender to the violence that lived in his blood, could become a demon of war and feed on the endless cycle of killing that the world seemed so eager to provide. In this path there was no severance, no ending, only an eternal ravenous now, a hunger that could never be satisfied, because satisfaction would mean the end of the hunger, and the end of the hunger would mean the end of the self. And there was the path of return. In this path, the wolf could help Kuro become fully human, could use the dragon's tears and the divine rice and the sacred waters to transform the boy from a vessel of divine power into an ordinary child, mortal, fragile, finite, free. This path did not kill the dragon or end its influence. It simply returned its gift, gently, to the one who had given it, and allowed the mortal world to continue on its mortal way. Each path demanded sacrifice. Each path led to a different kind of ending. And the wolf, standing at the crossroads, with the mortal blade in his hand, and the weight of an entire kingdom's fate resting on his scarred and weary shoulders, had to choose. Not which path was easiest, but which path was right. 2800. The cost of peace. Ashina lay dying in his castle. The great warrior, the man who had reclaimed a nation, the legend whose name had echoed through the mountains for decades. He was mortal after all. Age had come for him, as it comes for everyone, patient and inexorable. And now it claimed its due with the quiet authority of a debt collector who knows that all accounts must eventually be settled. But even in death, Ishin was not finished. Through the power of the black mortal blade, through the desperate incantation of a grandson who could not bear to let his grandfather go, Ishin was summoned back. Not as himself, not entirely. As a younger version of himself, a version forged in the heat of his greatest battles, a version that burned with the terrible vitality of a man who had not yet won his wars. The final battle took place in the courtyard of Ashina Castle. The wolf versus Ishin, the shinobi versus the sword saint. Two souls bound by duty and honour and the crushing weight of obligations that neither had chosen but both had accepted. The lightning cracked overhead, the wind howled through the ruined walls, and the blades sang their ancient song of steel meeting steel. It was not a battle of good against evil. It was a battle of two different kinds of love. Love for a master, love for a homeland, and the terrible understanding that love, in the end, sometimes demands the very thing we most wish to protect. The wolf won. The blade fell, and Ishin, the great Ishin, the sword saint, the founder of a kingdom, returned to the silence from which he had been dragged, his final breath a whisper that might have been gratitude or might have been regret. With him went the last great defence of Ashina, the final bulwark against the tide of history that was already lapping at the castle walls. Ashina fell. The interior ministry swept in like water through a broken dam, and the kingdom that Ishin had built was absorbed into the greater whole, its name becoming a footnote, its people becoming subjects, its history becoming a story told by old men to children who did not listen. But the dragon's heritage endured. In some versions of this story, the wolf completed his mission and severed the bond, dying peacefully in the knowledge that his master was safe and the cycle was broken. In others, he became a demon, a shadow of himself consumed by the violence he had once wielded with such precision. And in still others, he helped Kuro find his way back to mortality, and the two of them set out on a journey to return the dragon's gift to its source, a journey that would take them beyond the mountains, beyond the mortal world, to a place where the divine waters gathered and the great tree still bloomed in eternal spring. Each ending is true. Each ending is a reflection of a different choice, a different understanding of what it means to protect, to sacrifice, to let go. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of Ashina's story. There are no clean endings in a world where power exists. There is no resolution that does not cost something. The interior ministry replaced one kingdom with another, and the cycle of ambition and conquest continued, as it always does, grinding forward through the centuries like a millstone that knows nothing of the grain it crushes. But in the quiet spaces between the grinding, in the moments when the mist settles over the mountains, when the temple bell rings once and then fades, when the wind carries the scent of pine and snow through the empty corridors of a castle that was once the seat of a great and terrible power, in those moments something endures. Not the power, not the kingdom, not the immortality that was always more burden than blessing. The choice endures. The choice to protect, the choice to sacrifice, the choice to release what cannot be held and accept what cannot be changed, the choice to set down the blade and walk, unarmed and unafraid, into the ordinary mortal world where things end, and that is not a tragedy but a mercy. Because what is peace, really? Is it the absence of war, the silencing of conflict, or is it something quieter than that, something that lives not in the grand halls of power, but in the small, private moments when a person sets down their burden and allows themselves, for the first time in a very long while, to simply breathe? The mist settles over Ashina. The mountains stand as they have always stood, patient and indifferent and beautiful in the way that all beautiful things are beautiful, precisely because they do not last. The rivers carve their slow eternal paths through stone. The cedar trees whisper their ancient unintelligible secrets to the wind. And somewhere, in the space between sleeping and waking, between one breath and the next, the story of the wolf and the divine heir dissolves like mist in morning sunlight. Not because it was unimportant, but because all stories in the end find their way back to the silence from which they came. The silence is not empty, it is full of everything that has ever been said, and everything that has yet to be spoken, and everything that was always meant to remain unspoken, held gently like a lantern in the dark, like a breath before sleep, like the last faint echo of a temple bell ringing somewhere far away in the mountains. Let it settle now. Let the weight of kingdoms and blades and immortal blood drift away like leaves on a slow river. The story is told, the choices have been made, and the night is wide and soft and patient, as it always is, waiting to receive whatever you are ready to release. Good night.